4:30 in the morning, the Gulf of Oman. The MC-130J Combat Talon II was flying at 20,000 feet, its massive rear cargo ramp already lowered into the freezing night air. This was the moment the crew of the specialized transport aircraft had trained for. Yet the weight of the mission hung heavy in the pressurized cockpit. Inside the cavernous cargo hold, illuminated by the eerie green glow of floor-level tactical lights, sat a weapon of unprecedented scale. The GBU-43 Bravo, known officially as the Massive Ordnance Air Blast, rested on its heavy aluminum cradle. It was 30 feet of precision-guided destruction, painted in a dull, olive-drab finish that seemed to swallow the dim light. The air inside the hold was a chaotic mix of the screaming wind rushing past the open ramp and the sharp, metallic smell of hydraulic fluid. The loadmasters, connected to the internal communication system by long-corded headsets, moved with a deliberate, slow-motion precision. They checked the heavy nylon extraction straps one last time, ensuring the tension was exactly within the specified tolerances for a high-altitude release. Every movement was tracked by the infrared cameras mounted in the ceiling, feeding data back to the mission commanders thousands of miles away in the United States. The pilot, a lieutenant colonel with over 4,000 hours in the cockpit, kept his eyes locked on the heads-up display. The flight path was a thin green line, cutting through the blackness of the electronic map. To the north, the coastline of Iran was a jagged silhouette against the stars, invisible to the naked eye, but glowing brightly on the synthetic vision sensors. Somewhere beneath that darkness, buried under 80 feet of reinforced concrete and mountain granite near the port of Bandar Abbas, was the command bunker. This was not a routine patrol or a simple show of force. The mission had been authorized at the highest levels of the Department of Defense following 3 weeks of escalating provocations in the Strait of Hormuz. The objective was clear and absolute: the total destruction of the hardened underground command center and the elimination of the senior Revolutionary Guard leadership gathered within for an emergency war council. The aircraft shuddered as it hit, a pocket of turbulent air over the water. The navigator called out the progress over the secure net. They were exactly 12 minutes from the release point. The coordinates were already locked into the weapon's internal inertial guidance system. 27 degrees 12 minutes north, 56 degrees 15 minutes east. The crew could feel the vibration of the 4 heavy turboprop engines through the soles of their boots. It was a rhythmic, soul-shaking thrum that competed with the whistle of the high-altitude wind. On the flight deck, the electronic warfare officer monitored the passive sensors with intense focus. So far, the Iranian radar sites along the coast remained quiet, their operators likely unaware of the heavy transport aircraft loitering just outside their primary engagement zones. But the silence was deceptive and brittle. 200 miles to the south, the aircraft carrier USS Gerald R. Ford was already turning into the wind, launching its own screen of F-35 Bravo stealth fighters to provide top cover for the egress. The entire machinery of the United States military was beginning to turn, all focused on the singular point in space where the palletized cradle would slide off the ramp and into the abyss. The lead loadmaster signaled a thumbs up to the internal camera. The safety pins had been pulled. The GBU-43 Bravo was now live. It sat there, a 9-ton predator waiting for the gravity of the Earth to take over. The thin air at 20,000 feet was bitter cold, causing frost to form on the edges of the cargo rails and the oxygen masks of the crew. The smell of the sea, salt-heavy and thick, rose up from the darkness below, mixing with the hot, burnt toast scent of the aircraft's electrical systems. In the cockpit, the countdown began. The mission was moving from the realm of planning into the reality of execution. There would be no second chances and no loitering for a better look. Once the extraction parachute deployed, the physics of the strike would be irreversible. The crew took a final breath of canned oxygen, their eyes fixed on the digital clocks. The seconds ticked down. In a heavy, expectant silence, the only sound the mechanical heartbeat of the Combat Talon II as it bore down on the coast of Iran. The decision to deploy the GBU-43 Bravo was not made in a vacuum, nor was it the first choice of the National Security Council. For 18 months, the geopolitical landscape in the Middle East had been fracturing under the weight of a renewed and aggressive expansionism from Tehran. The specific catalyst for Operation Anvil Strike was a series of coordinated maritime attacks that had effectively paralyzed the Strait of Hormuz, the world's most critical choke point for global energy supplies. The crisis began in late 2025, when Iranian-backed militias utilized sophisticated drone swarms to disable 3 Western-flagged tankers in a single afternoon. These were not random acts of piracy. They were precision strikes designed to demonstrate that no vessel, regardless of its escort, was safe within the Persian Gulf. In the weeks that followed, the United States Navy's Fifth Fleet reported an unprecedented increase in aggressive maneuvers by Revolutionary Guard fast attack craft, often closing within 50 yards of American destroyers like the USS Mason. By February of 2026, the intelligence community had intercepted a series of high-level communications that changed the nature of the threat. Signals intelligence, gathered by the National Security Agency and analyzed at Fort Meade, indicated that the Revolutionary Guard's Quds Force was coordinating a massive, multi-theater offensive. The plan involved simultaneous strikes against United States bases in Iraq and Syria, combined with a total blockade of the strait. Central to this plan was the Anvil, a massive underground command and control hub located deep within the coastal mountains of the Hormozgan province. This facility was the brain of the Iranian military machine in the south. It housed the fiber optic nodes, the satellite uplinks, and the hardened bunkers, where the top tier of the Iranian military leadership directed their operations. The White House had attempted a series of diplomatic de-escalations, but each was met with further defiance. The final straw came when a United States Air Force RQ-4 Global Hawk flying in international airspace was downed by a sophisticated surface-to-air missile. The debris fell into the sea, but the message was clear. The deterrence that had held for years was gone. The Joint Chiefs of Staff presented the president with 3 options: a full-scale air campaign, a limited cruise missile strike, or a single, devastating decapitation blow against the Anvil facility. The choice of the GBU-43 Bravo was a deliberate strategic message. A standard Tomahawk cruise missile, while precise, lacked the kinetic energy and the overpressure required to collapse a facility buried 80 feet underground. The Massive Ordnance Air Blast, however, was designed for exactly this purpose. Its 18,000 pounds of high explosives were not intended to just blow a hole in the ground. They were meant to generate a vacuum pressure wave that would travel through ventilation shafts and heavy steel doors, crushing everything inside. The mission was classified as a Tier 1 strategic necessity. The commanders gathered at the Anvil facility were the primary architects of the maritime blockade. Intelligence suggested that the Supreme Leader's most trusted military advisor, along with 3 senior generals of the Revolutionary Guard, would be present for a final planning session before the blockade was to be fully implemented. The atmosphere in the Pentagon's National Military Command Center was electric as the mission moved into the execution phase. The smell of stale coffee and the hum of high-powered servers filled the room where generals and intelligence officers watched the live feeds. They knew that a strike of this magnitude would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the region. It was a move of extreme risk, but the alternative, a prolonged and bloody war at sea, was deemed unacceptable. Every contingency had been accounted for. The logistics of moving the massive weapon from Eglin Air Force Base to the forward operating location had been a masterclass in military secrecy. The MC-130J, an aircraft usually reserved for special operations and tactical transport, had been modified to carry the weapon's unique pallet system. As the aircraft approached the drop zone, the political reality was stripped away, leaving only the cold, hard mathematics of an aerial delivery. The target was designated Objective Vulcan, but to the intelligence analysts at the National Security Agency and the Defense Intelligence Agency, it was known simply as the Anvil. Located at coordinates 27 degrees 12 minutes north, 56 degrees 15 minutes east, the facility was a masterpiece of Persian engineering and tactical paranoia. It was carved directly into the limestone and granite roots of the Koué Genu mountain range, less than 20 miles north of the critical naval port at Bandar Abbas. Intelligence gathered over a decade suggested the complex was divided into 3 distinct subterranean levels. The first level, buried 30 feet beneath a cap of reinforced concrete, served as the primary logistics and administrative hub. It was here that the daily operations of the Southern Command were managed, staffed by hundreds of mid-level officers and technicians. The second level was deeper still, at 60 feet, housing the massive diesel generators, air filtration systems, and the secure server farms that processed encrypted data from across the Persian Gulf. But it was the third level, the sacred chamber, that necessitated the use of the GBU-43 Bravo. At 80 feet below the surface, protected by layers of shock-absorbing lead and high-density polymer, sat the hardened command and control center. This level was shielded from traditional electronic eavesdropping and was designed to withstand a direct hit from a 2,000-pound bunker buster. It was the nerve center where the Revolutionary Guard's most sensitive naval operations were conceived and executed. The air in the windowless watch floor at the Pentagon was cool and filled with the faint, metallic scent of ozone from the rows of high-speed processors. On the primary display, a composite image formed from contract, satellite-based synthetic aperture radar, and thermal imaging showed the mountain in a spectrum of blues and oranges. The heat signatures were unmistakable. The ventilation shafts, cleverly disguised as natural rock formations, were glowing with the thermal exhaust of a facility operating at maximum capacity. Signals intelligence had confirmed the arrival of the targets 6 hours earlier. General Mohammad Al-Bakr, the chief architect of the asymmetric naval strategy, had been tracked from Tehran by a series of high-altitude stealth drones. He was joined by Rear Admiral Zahiri, the commander of the Revolutionary Guard's naval forces in the Strait. Along with them were 5 other senior commanders, each a key pillar in the planned blockade of the global energy corridor. The presence of these individuals transformed the Anvil from a static military installation into a target of extreme strategic opportunity. The window for the strike was narrow. Intelligence suggested the meeting would conclude within 90 minutes, after which the commanders would disperse to their respective forward operating bases. The decision to strike was a clinical calculation of risk versus gain. Eliminating this specific group of leaders would not just disrupt the immediate blockade, it would shatter the institutional memory and command structure of the Southern Revolutionary Guard for years to come. The facility was not undefended. Surrounding the mountain were several batteries of HQ-9 surface-to-air missiles, their radar dishes constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of a conventional airstrike. However, the American plan relied on a different kind of stealth. By using a single, high-altitude transport aircraft flying a profile that mimicked a civilian cargo flight, the mission commanders hoped to get the weapon within its release envelope before the Iranian air defenses could react. The sensors on the MC-130J Combat Talon II continued to feed real-time data to the analysts. They monitored the seismic vibrations of the mountain, detecting the faint thrum of the underground generators. It was a mechanical heartbeat that confirmed the targets were still in place. The target profile was complete, the coordinates were verified, and the physics of the strike were now the only remaining variables. The Anvil was no longer a fortress. It was a grave waiting to be sealed. The GBU-43 Bravo is a weapon of extreme proportions, measuring 30 feet in length and weighing over 21,600 pounds. It is the largest satellite-guided conventional weapon in the United States inventory, specifically engineered to provide the massive overpressure required to collapse hardened subterranean structures. Inside its thin-walled aluminum skin sits 18,700 pounds of H6 explosive, a powerful military-grade mixture of RDX, TNT, and aluminum powder. The weapon's design is a departure from traditional gravity bombs, which rely on thick steel casings to penetrate the earth before detonating. Instead, the Massive Ordnance Air Blast is designed to maximize the blast radius and atmospheric shockwave, utilizing its high-performance explosive filler to create a vacuum pressure effect. The air in the cargo hold of the MC-130J was thin and frigid, the cold metal of the weapon's casing coated in a fine layer of condensation that froze instantly into a white frost. Deployment of such a massive platform requires a specialized, palletized delivery system known as the cradle. Unlike smaller munitions that drop from external pylons, the GBU-43 Bravo is pulled from the cargo ramp by a heavy extraction parachute. Once the weapon clears the aircraft, the cradle is jettisoned, and 4 lattice-style grid fins at the rear of the bomb deploy with a sharp, mechanical snap. These fins, controlled by the KMU-593B guidance kit, allowed the weapon to steer itself through the thin atmosphere with remarkable precision. The guidance system relies on a hardened GPS and inertial navigation unit, which constantly calculates the weapon's position relative to the target coordinates. As the bomb falls, it adjusts its trajectory to ensure it strikes at the exact angle required to channel the blast energy into the bunker's ventilation shafts and entry portals. The technology is designed to operate even in environments where electronic jamming is prevalent, ensuring that the strike remains accurate despite Iranian electronic warfare efforts. Inside the cargo hold, the crew could smell the sharp, chemical scent of the hydraulic fluid used to operate the ramp and the heavy-duty tie-down straps. The weapon sat like a dormant predator, its olive-drab paint job scuffed from the rigors of transport, but its internal systems fully energized and communicating with the aircraft's mission computer. The loadmasters monitored the digital readouts, watching as the weapon's internal heaters maintained the sensitive electronics at their optimal operating temperature in the sub-zero environment. Tactically, the weapon serves 2 purposes: physical destruction and psychological paralysis. The sheer scale of the explosion is visible for dozens of miles, and the sound of the detonation can be heard across entire provinces. For the mission commanders, however, the primary focus was the 18,000 pounds of high explosives that were about to be unleashed. The calculations were precise. The overpressure wave would reach levels of several thousand pounds per square inch, far exceeding the structural limits of the reinforced concrete ceilings in the Anvil facility. The MC-130J continued its steady flight. The massive weapon now just minutes from its release, the loadmasters stood clear of the center lane. Their tethered harnesses pulled tight as they prepared for the sudden shift in the aircraft's center of gravity. The weapon was a masterpiece of specialized engineering, a singular tool for a singular task, and the physics of its design were about to be tested against the most hardened target in the region. 5 minutes to release. The MC-130J Combat Talon II was now deep within the drop corridor, its navigation lights extinguished, and its skin absorbing the faint starlight over the Gulf. Inside the hold, the loadmaster's voice cracked over the internal comms, announcing the 5-minute warning. The air rushing through the open ramp was a freezing gale, carrying the sharp, iron scent of the sea and the chemical bite of the high-altitude atmosphere. The weapon, 21,000 pounds of steel and high explosives, sat on its aluminum pallet. The secondary safety straps were already retracted. Now, only the primary extraction line connected the massive GBU-43 Bravo to its release mechanism. The loadmasters, braced against the fuselage walls, watched the digital countdown on their wrist-mounted displays. Every second was a physical weight in the vibrating cargo bay. At 2 minutes, the aircraft's nose pitched up slightly, a deliberate maneuver to assist the gravity-fed extraction. The pilot's hands were steady on the controls, maintaining a precise airspeed of 250 knots. One mistake here, a sudden gust of wind or a mechanical hiccup in the pallet rails, could send the weapon tumbling through the airframe, destroying the aircraft and the crew instantly. 30 seconds to release, the navigator called out. The primary loadmaster held his hand up, 5 fingers extended, then began the physical countdown. 4, 3, 2, 1. With a mechanical roar that rivaled the wind, the extraction parachute deployed into the slipstream. It caught the air with a violent snap, the heavy nylon cords pulling taut in a fraction of a second. The pallet, carrying the 18,000-pound warhead, began to move. It slid down the steel floor rails with a scream of metal on metal, gaining momentum until it cleared the edge of the ramp. The aircraft surged upward, suddenly lightened by over 10 tons. The crew felt the floor drop beneath their feet as the pilot corrected for the massive shift in the center of gravity. Behind them, falling into the black void, the GBU-43 Bravo was away. 3 seconds into the fall, the cradle jettisoned. The heavy aluminum frame fell away like a discarded shell, leaving the weapon alone in the 7th night sky. The 4 grid fins at the rear snapped open, biting into the thin air. The internal KMU-593B guidance system hummed to life, its sensors locking onto the GPS constellation. The weapon was no longer a passive object. It was a guided predator. It pitched its nose down, beginning a steep, controlled dive toward the Iranian coastline. On the flight deck, the electronic warfare officer watched the telemetry. The weapon was tracking perfectly, its internal computer making micro adjustments to the fin angles to stay on the green line of the target solution. Below, the Kue Genu Mountains were a jagged, silent shadow. The command bunker sat beneath them, oblivious to the 9-ton mass of high explosives, falling toward it at near-sonic speeds. The release was clean. The physics of the strike were now in motion, and the time for intervention had passed. The weapon reached its terminal velocity, a screaming 9-ton cylinder of steel and high explosives slicing through the final 500 feet of atmosphere. At 20 feet above the target coordinates, the dual proximity fuses triggered. The GBU-43 Bravo did not just explode, it erased the air around it. A fireball that bleached the night sky white erupted instantly. The 18,000 pounds of H6 explosive converting into a wall of expanding gas at 6,000 degrees. The heat blast washed across the mountain face, vaporizing the scrub brush and melting the disguised steel ventilation grates in a fraction of a millisecond. The shockwave, a visible ripple in the air, punched straight into the main entrance of the Anvil facility. The 3-ton reinforced steel blast doors were not just breached, they were shredded and driven backward into the primary access tunnel like shrapnel. The pressure wave, moving at 3,000 meters per second, compressed the air inside the tunnels until it reached the temperature of the sun. The secondary and tertiary levels of the bunker shuddered as the mountain itself groaned under the kinetic energy. Inside the sacred chamber, the reaction was absolute. The ceiling, designed to withstand standard munitions, could not hold against the sustained overpressure of the air blast. The mountain granite above the command center fractured, sending 10-ton slabs of rock crashing down into the server farms and the war room. The senior commanders had exactly 1 second to look up before the pressure crushed their lungs and the collapsing mountain buried them beneath 80 feet of stone. A massive column of black smoke and pulverized concrete boiled out of the mountain's side, rising 5,000 feet into the air. The sound of the detonation cracked eardrums. 10 miles away at Naval Station Bandar Abbas, for 3 seconds, there was a terrifying dead silence as the atmosphere rushed back in, to fill the vacuum created by the blast. Then came the secondary explosions. The facility's fuel stores and ammunition lockers cooking off deep, underground, sending rhythmic tremors through the earth that were recorded by seismic sensors as far away as Dubai. The Anvil was no longer a command center. It was a collapsed, burning tomb. The immediate aftermath of the strike was not measured in voices, but in the frantic, electronic screaming of a regional air defense network, suddenly realizing it was under attack. Within 90 seconds of the detonation, the Iranian radar sites at Bandar Abbas and Keshem Island erupted into life. High-frequency pulses from HQ-9 surface-to-air missile batteries tore through the night sky, their operators desperately searching for the ghost that had just leveled the Kue Genu command complex. The shockwave had been so massive that it triggered automated seismic alerts across the Persian Gulf. In the United Arab Emirates, Oman, and as far south as Qatar, sensors registered a magnitude 4.2 event originating from the Iranian coast. The dead silence following the blast lasted only moments before the radio frequencies became a chaotic mess of panicked, overlapping transmissions. Iranian naval units in the Strait of Hormuz, suddenly cut off from their central command, began firing flares and activating their fire control radars, in a blind, reflexive response to the loss of their leadership. 300 miles away, in the Combined Air Operations Center at Al Udeid Air Base, the atmosphere was one of clinical intensity. The smell of recycled air and the low hum of the massive cooling units provided the backdrop for a symphony of electronic warfare. Vampire, 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 a technician called out, identifying the first of several Iranian anti-ship missiles launched blindly from coastal batteries toward the general direction of the American carrier group. The United States Navy's response was instantaneous and surgical. From the deck of the cruiser USS Mason, the Mark 41 vertical launch system fired. A ripple of evolved Sea Sparrow missiles shrieked into the air, their white exhaust plumes carving jagged lines against the black horizon as they accelerated to intercept the incoming threats. The Gulf air, once still, was now shredded by the sounds of supersonic interceptions and the roar of afterburners. On the Iranian mainland, the chaos was physical. The roads leading to the Anvil facility were blocked by landslides triggered by the blast. First responders from Bandar Abbas found themselves driving into a landscape that looked like a lunar wasteland, the air thick with the acrid stink of burnt high explosives and pulverized limestone. The fires from the secondary explosions beneath the mountain were so intense that the ground itself felt hot through the tires of their vehicles. As the Iranian military attempted to organize a counterstrike, they were met with a wall of electronic interference. American EA-18 Gulf Growlers, loitering high over the Gulf, began a full-spectrum jam of the Iranian command frequencies. The goal was to maintain the fog of war to keep the surviving elements of the Revolutionary Guard from coordinating their response while the strike aircraft cleared the area. The regional response was a mixture of blind rage and systemic paralysis. The brain of the Southern Command had been removed, and the limbs were twitching in the dark. The egress of the MC-130J Combat Talon II was not a solitary flight back to safety. It was the focal point of a massive, pre-planned protective umbrella. As the transport aircraft turned south, away from the burning mountainside, the airspace over the Strait of Hormuz became the most contested and lethal environment on the planet. Leading the screen were 4 F-22 Raptors from the 1st Fighter Wing, operating out of Al-Dhafra. They were ghosts in the machine, their stealth coatings absorbing the desperate sweeps of Iranian ground-based radar. The pilots, breathing pure oxygen and pulling high G-forces as they climbed to 40,000 feet, monitored the God's Eye view provided by their integrated sensors. To the Iranian HQ-9 operators, the sky appeared empty, but the Raptors had already locked onto every active emitter along the coast. 16 miles to the east, the Iranian Air Force scrambled 2 4 Phantoms and a single Su-35 from Tactical Air Base 9. The older Phantoms roared into the sky, their twin engines leaving thick black soot trails against the dawn light. The Iranian pilots were flying on adrenaline and raw orders, pushed into a fight where they were technologically blind. They were searching for a heavy transport, but they found the Raptors instead. The engagement was clinical. From 30 miles away, the lead Raptor pilot squeezed the trigger on the stick. 2 AIM-120 missiles dropped from the internal bays, their rocket motors igniting. In a sequence that took less than a second, there was no radio chatter, only the cold, mechanical confirmation of Fox 3 over the secure data link. The missiles accelerated to Mach 4, their active radar seekers homing in on the heat and metal of the Iranian Phantoms. The Iranian pilots never saw the strike coming. The first AIM-120 punched through the fuselage of the lead Phantom just behind the cockpit. The aircraft erupted in a white-hot flash, the fuel cells detonating and sending the twin-engine jet into a terminal, burning spin. The second Phantom pilot, seeing his wingman disappear in a fireball, broke hard to the left, dropping chaff and flares in a desperate attempt to break a lock he couldn't even identify. It was useless. The Raptor's missile adjusted its fins with mathematical precision, followed the Phantom through the turn, and shredded the tail section. The aircraft disintegrated, the debris falling like burning rain into the dark waters of the Gulf. The Su-35, realizing the slaughter taking place, banked steeply and dove back toward the mainland, its pilot pushing the throttles into full afterburner to escape the invisible hunters. The Raptors did not pursue. Their mission was not a war of attrition, but the protection of the strike asset. Below the dogfights, EA-18 Gulf Growlers continued to flood the spectrum with electronic noise. The smell of the salt air and the low-frequency rumble of distant explosions defined the environment for the sailors on the aircraft carrier as they watched the radar scopes. The air superiority mission was a success. The corridor of safety remained open, a clear path of blue sky maintained by the most advanced fighters in the world. By the time the sun began to peek over the horizon, the sky was once again clear of foreign military interceptors, leaving only the fading contrails of a lopsided air battle. Sunlight began to touch the jagged peaks of the Kuwait-Jinu Mountains, revealing a scene of absolute geological and structural devastation. High above, out of reach of any remaining Iranian eyes, a KH-11 Kenan reconnaissance satellite adjusted its aperture. The resulting high-resolution imagery, transmitted in near real time to the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, confirmed what the seismic sensors had already suggested. The Anvil was gone. The primary entrance to the facility, once a reinforced portal capable of withstanding heavy artillery, was now a jagged, blackened scar in the mountainside. The massive GBU-43 Bravo had not just collapsed the entry. The overpressure had traveled through the mountain's internal conduits, causing a catastrophic failure of the limestone overhead. Satellite imagery showed a massive subsidence crater directly above the sacred chamber. A physical indentation in the mountain, where 80 feet of rock had simply dropped into the void left by the collapsed bunker. In the windowless analysis rooms of the Pentagon, the mood was one of grim professional satisfaction. Analysts used specialized software to overlay the post-strike imagery with the pre-mission blueprints. The heat signatures were the most telling. Thermal sensors detected massive, sustained heat plumes rising from the ventilation shafts, indicating that the facility's secondary fuel stores were still burning hundreds of feet underground. There were no signs of life, no vehicles moving near the entrance, no emergency teams attempting to dig through the thousands of tons of fallen granite. Signals intelligence provided the final, definitive confirmation. The National Security Agency had been monitoring the encrypted cellular and radio nets of the Revolutionary Guard's headquarters in Tehran. For 3 hours following the strike, there was absolute radio silence from the Southern Command. Then, the traffic erupted not in orders, but in frantic, unencrypted queries from subordinate units asking why the Anvil had gone dark. By 10 in the morning, the casualty list was finalized by the Central Intelligence Agency. The decapitation was total. General Mohammad Al-Bakr, the mastermind of the maritime blockade, was confirmed killed in action. Alongside him were Rear Admiral Zahiri and 5 other high-ranking officers of the Quds Force and the Revolutionary Guard Navy. These were the men who held the keys to the asymmetric war in the Strait. Their deaths left the Iranian naval forces in the south without a cohesive command structure. The battle damage assessment was categorized as total mission success. The physical infrastructure was obliterated beyond repair, and the human capital, the strategic minds behind the regional escalation, had been eliminated in a single 18,000-pound heartbeat. The tactical data was clear. The threat of a coordinated blockade had been neutralized, not by a long campaign of attrition, but by the surgical application of overwhelming kinetic energy. The report was marked with a final digital stamp and forwarded to the White House, closing the loop on the most significant American strike in the region in decades. The strategic shockwaves of Operation Anvil Strike were felt far beyond the pulverized granite of the Kuwait-Jinu Mountains. Within 48 hours of the detonation, the aggressive maritime maneuvers that had paralyzed the Strait of Hormuz came to a sudden and absolute halt. Without the centralized command of the Revolutionary Guard's southern hub, the individual fast attack craft and drone units lacked the coordination, required to sustain a blockade against the United States Navy. The political fallout in Tehran was equally severe. The loss of General Mohammad Al-Bakr and his senior staff created a power vacuum that triggered an internal struggle for control within the Revolutionary Guard. This administrative paralysis effectively neutralized Iran's offensive capabilities in the Persian Gulf for the remainder of the spring. The Anvil, once a symbol of Iranian defiance and subterranean engineering, became a cautionary tale for military planners worldwide regarding the vulnerability of even the most hardened facilities to precision air blast technology. For the United States, the mission reinforced the strategic doctrine of decisive, limited engagement strikes. The carrier, USS Gerald R. Ford, remained on station in the North Arabian Sea, its strike groups continuing to fly combat air patrols as a visible reminder of American resolve. The successful deployment of the GBU-43 Bravo from a transport platform demonstrated a flexible and terrifying new capability for the Indo-Pacific Command, signaling that no bunker, regardless of depth, was truly beyond the reach of the Pentagon. As the sun set over the Gulf, the MC-130J Combat Talon II touched down at its forward operating base. The aircraft was once again silent, its cargo hold empty, and the smell of the sea still clinging to its airframe. The crew walked across the tarmac in the cooling desert air, the weight of the mission slowly giving way to the routine of debriefing. The strategic landscape had been fundamentally altered by a single 18,000-pound event, leaving a dead silence where the drums of war had once been loudest.